Hello everyone, today's topic is related to dural folds or the dural extensions. First of all, what is dura? Dura is non-elastic fibrous membrane. Non-elastic fibrous membrane, and dura is further divided into two layers. That is, outer one is endosteal layer and inner layer is meningeal layer. Dural extensions are seen only in the cranial dura. We are studying the extensions of cranial dura, and these extensions are made by the infolding or the inward projections of the meningeal layer. Endosteal layer act as a inner periosteal layer of the skull bone. Meningeal layer. It forms four inward projection or processes that are falx cerebri, tentorium cerebelli, falx cerebelli, diaphragma, selle. These four projections are falx cerebelli, then tentorium cerebelli, falx cerebelli, and diaphragma selle. These are the four projections that are formed by the inward folding or inward projections of the meningeal layer of the cranial dura. Now, in this diagram, we will see this sickle shaped projection is falx cerebelli, and this bilateral projection, somewhat horizontal projection, is made by the tentorium cerebelli. This is the tentorium cerebelli. Then again one sickle shaped projection at below the tentorium is falx cerebelli, and a round projection around the sella turcica is diaphragma selle. In detail we will study falx cerebelli. Now, falx cerebelli, as we seen, it is sickle shaped, and where it lies, its position is, it projects mid sagittally from roof of the skull into the median longitudinal fissure. From skull to the median longitudinal, there is a median longitudinal. If we see the brain, in the cerebrum at midline we see a fissure. That fissure is termed as the median longitudinal fissure. So this falx cerebri extend from the vault up in between these two hemispheres. It projects mid-sagittally from the roof of the skull into the median longitudinal fissure of two cerebral hemispheres. Now, what are the presenting parts? Presenting parts of the falx cerebri. In 3D, if we see two ends, anterior and posterior end of the falx cerebri, and two surfaces or two margins. We have convex margin, that is the attached margin, and concave margin. Two margins and two ends. Now, first of all, the anterior end is narrower and it is fixed to the crista galli of the ethmoid bone. This is the crista galli. Here lies the anterior end of the falx cerebelli, and the posterior end is broader and it blends with the upper surface of the tentorium cerebelli in the median plane. Now, convex margin. Now, this convex margin is attached to the lips of the sagittal sulcus on the inner aspect of the cranial wall, and it extends from the crista galli to the internal occipital protuberance up to here. This is the extent of the convex margin. Convex margin is attached to the lips of the sagittal sulcus on the inner aspect of the vault of the skull. And the concave margin, this margin is the concave margin, and this margin is free. It's free. This is the anterior end attached to the crista galli. It is narrower in comparison to the posterior end. Here lies the posterior end, and this one is the attached margin from the crista galli up to the internal occipital protuberance. These are the presenting parts of the falx cerebelli. The concave margin, that is the free margin, comes closer to the corpus callosum in the posterior part. Now, second projection is the tentorium cerebelli. Tentorium cerebelli, it lies somewhat horizontally. Shape is like tent-like shape. Therefore, it is termed as the tentorium cerebelli. It projects in the transverse fissure, which projects in transverse fissure, which intervenes between the occipital lobes of the cerebrum and cerebellum. It projects in the transverse fissure between the occipital lobes of the cerebrum and the cerebellum. It lies horizontally. Now, the presenting parts. Broadly, tentorium cerebelli is divided into two: attached margin and free margin. Now, if we see in this diagram, this is the tentorium cerebelli, and in this we have this portion is the, in this we see only the half of the tentorium. This is the attached margin of the tentorium cerebelli and tentorium cerebelli. This is the attached margin of the tentorium cerebelli, and this one is the free margin of the tentorium cerebelli. Now, first of all, the attached margin. Posteriorly, it attached at the transverse sulci of the occipital bone. This is the occipital protuberance, and these are the transverse sulci of the occipital bone, and here is the posterior attachment of the tentorium cerebelli. Posteriorly, tentorium cerebelli attached at the transverse sulci of the occipital bone. Laterally at the upper border of the petrous part of the temporal bone. This is the petrous part of the temporal bone. Laterally, it extends at the upper border of the petrous part of the temporal bone, and these are the margins of attached portion of the tentorium cerebelli. Now, the attached margin ends at the anterior end of the attached margin is attached at the posterior clinoid processes of dorsum selle. This is the attached margin of the tentorium cerebelli. Now, free margin forms tentorial notch, and it is U-shaped, as we see in this diagram. This is the tentorial notch. This is the tentorium cerebelli. These are the attached margin up to the dorsum selle, and this is U-shaped notch is tentorial notch formed by the free margin of the tentorium cerebelli, and the free margin, ends of the free margin attached at the anterior clinoid processes of the lesser wing of the sphenoid. Now, attached margin attached up to the posterior clinoid processes, and the free margin extend up to the anterior clinoid processes of the lesser wing of the sphenoid bone. Now, the peculiarities. Now, in this we will see these are the posterior clinoid processes and these are the anterior clinoid processes. Attached margin ends at the level of posterior clinoid processes, and free margin extend up to the anterior clinoid processes and get attached to the anterior clinoid processes. Now, why it is termed as the tentorium cerebelli? The midline attachment of the falx cerebelli, that is the posterior end of the falx cerebelli, is attached on the upper surface of the tentorium, and it pulls it upwards. Now, this is the posterior, this is the tent-like tentorium cerebelli, and this is the posterior end of the falx cerebelli, which get attached on the upper surface of the tentorium. This falx cerebelli pulls it upwards, and it resembles like a tent for the cerebellum. Therefore, it is termed as tentorium cerebelli. Now, at the apex of the petrous part of the temporal bone, attached margin is closed over the, these are the anterior clinoid process, these are the posterior clinoid processes. Now, Attached margin comes up to the posterior clinoid processes. Free margins, free, that is the tentorial notch, crosses it laterally and attached up to the anterior clinoid processes. This is the margin of the free margin of tentorial notch ends up to the anterior clinoid processes, and attached margin ends up to the posterior clinoid processes, and little lateral to the area of crossing. Inferior layer of the, this is the vitreous part of the temporal bone, little lateral to this is midline and this is lateral, little lateral to this, the inferior layer of the tentorium cerebelli is pouch forward into the middle cranial fossa and form a blind pouch, and this blind pouch is termed as cavum trigeminale, where we have the ganglion for the trigeminal nerve. Little lateral to the area of the crossing, inferior layer of the tentorium projects forward as a blind pouch in the middle cranial fossa, and this cavum trigeminale is below the superior petrosal sinus. Now, one more term related to this area is oculomotor trigon. Oculomotor is related to oculomotor nerve, that is the cranial nerve 3. In front of the crossing, same, in front of this crossing, this is cavum trigeminale lies lateral to the crossing. In front of the crossing means in anteriorly we have oculomotor trigon, which is pierced by, in front of the crossing, this is the two clinoid processes, this is the attached one, laterally we have this. Now in front of this crossing, this dural fold is pierced by cranial nerve 3 and cranial nerve 4, that is the oculomotor nerve and the trochlear nerve, and this oculomotor trigon in front is continuous with the roof of the cavernous sinus. This oculomotor trigon being continuous with the roof of the cavernous sinus. Cavernous sinus is again an important topic we will study in another lecture. Now again the tentorium cerebelli divides the cranial cavity into the two compartments, that is the supratentorial compartment and subtentorial compartment. Now the gap between the free margin and the dorsum selle, as we will see in the diagram, this is the free margin and here is dorsum selle, not diaphragma selle, dorsum selle of the sphenoid bone. This gap is occupied by midbrain and the part of the superior vermis of the cerebellum. Cerebrum is divided into forebrain, midbrain and hindbrain. This notch contains the midbrain portion of the cerebrum and part of the superior vermis of the cerebellum, and the gap between the midbrain and the tentorial notch, is the only area of communication between the subtentorial and supratentorial compartments. So tentorium cerebelli, horizontal fold that divides the cranial cavity into the supratentorial and infratentorial or subtentorial compartments, and this falx cerebri and falx cerebelli, these are in the midline, and these divides the cranial cavity into right and left compartments, right and left halves. Now diaphragma selle. Diaphragma selle is a circular dural fold. It is a circular dural fold, forms the roof of the sella turcica. Sella turcica is a part of the sphenoid bone. It forms the roof of sella turcica, and this roof is perforated by the infundibular stalk of the hypophysis, that is the pituitary. This is the sphenoid bone. These are the anterior clinoid processes made by the lesser wing, and these are the posterior clinoid processes made by the dorsum selle, and this is sella turcica, and the roof of sella turcica is diaphragma selle. It is horizontally oriented. this. Now attachments of the diaphragma selle. Anteriorly it is attached to the tuberculum selle. Now anteriorly it is attached to the tuberculum selle and posteriorly to the dorsum selle. The upper layer of the diaphragma selle is continuous bilaterally with the roof of the cavernous sinus. Cavernous sinus lies laterally to the diaphragma selle. Point to be noted is in sella turcica, all the three meninges blend intimately with each other and with the fibrous capsule of the hypophysis cerebri. So we can't distinguish between the subdural and subarachnoid spaces. Now falx cerebelli. Now falx cerebelli, again it is a sickle shaped fold. Position, it lies below the tentorium cerebelli, and from it extends from the internal occipital crest to the postcerebellar notch. Now it is sickle shaped. It has a base and an apex. So base is the broader part. Base is attached to the inferior surface of the tentorium cerebelli, and the apex part is attached at the posterior margin of the foramina magnum. So this is the occipital protuberance, this is the crest, and somewhat here lies the attached margin of the tentorium cerebelli, and so this is the tentorium cerebelli. Now it is sickle shaped. Base is attached to the inferior surface of the tentorium cerebelli and apex is attached up to the margin of the foramina magnum. This is the foramina magnum. This is base and this is apex. And this is foramina magnum. And here is the base, apex. Thank you.